Thanks for inviting us. Following Mark is very emotional. As Olga, your sentiments are shared. We are architects in the SENTRY team. We're focused on the built environment and all of its impacts on people and the planet. Generally speaking, security has not been central to architectural theory or education or even research. And in fact, there is very little that has originated from architectural discourse on this topic. So we are really trying to build a new research area in our field. But in the realm of practicing architects, especially those designing schools, are increasingly needing to consider security in addition to and competing with many other factors that go into designing schools, from pedagogy to sustainability to health and safety. As part of SENTRY, we are working on research that supports a decision support framework. So we wanted to understand how these security design decisions are made and what impacts they might have. What we found is an abundance of recommendations out there on school security, published in guidelines, in books, and conferences, and even manufacturers developing products to integrate into the process of design or the final construction. But the references in these documents to the efficacy of those strategies or technologies was scarce. And I would say the quality of the evidence presented was not always clear and can be diffuse. So this represents a problem because, of course, each school or venue is trying to make decisions in a very particular context and require making their own assessment of risks. Each recommendation comes with trade-offs, and those are required because the resources of schools are finite. Some widely recommended interventions have downsides. They can be detrimental to safety or climate. And the wrong design decisions are, of course, this resources misallocated, and that can be harmful. So what we thought was needed was a robust assessment of the evidence and a synthesis of the guidance to help decision makers, particularly on designing the built environment. So we have been conducting systematic research, gathering qualitative data, not only in an extensive literature review, but also interviews with practitioners and from official reports of mass shootings in schools in the United States. And we try to validate this knowledge that we're generating by evaluating the quantity and quality of evidence in the literature, by evaluating how designers' strategies follow guidance, or how they prioritize school climate, or if they have a low risk of harm or trade-offs, and generating building prototypes and scenarios where we can generalize more knowledge by supporting simulations of those strategies that are lacking in evidence. And then we set out to create and test how new visual guidance can be more adaptable to different contexts and building types, how to better present the state of evidence on those and be more nuanced about the trade-offs. We do this by presenting concepts or design principles we call strategies, and a variety of tactics, which are different ways of accomplishing these same strategies so that there's some adaptability. Now we are triangulating between these different sources of data. What are the recommendations in the literature? What has evidence? What actually is happening in these incidents? And what are architects doing when they're designing schools? We started with reviewing hundreds of unique recommendations across the literature. We organize them into categories. We find how frequently they appear across all the different documents. This shows us that the vast majority of recommendations are in what Mark was talking about, the planning phase, the procedural, how to get teams together, how to think about the problem, who to include, all very good and important decisions. But there was a little less directly architectural. A second grouping of the recommendations with medium frequency are considerations of barriers and entry control. So focus on, essentially establishing a perimeter, and then some significant number on, how to create a positive and safe climate in the school. Now, these might seem like they could be opposites, like physical barriers. Does it create a positive climate? They're not necessarily opposite. We find that people do need to feel safe, feeling the space or the territory as somewhat defined, protected is important. But physical barriers can contribute to limiting or negatively affecting climate or the operations of the school. So it is a nuanced and complex problem. And then the less frequently recommended are the subset of recommendations on technology, the tools for reporting, the personnel, et cetera. And there's a lot of debate around that. The image on the top right, you can see that an early analysis of the evidence where we looked at how many citations each recommendation had. And we found a general trend that, the more frequently recommended strategies tended to have more citations, which is generally good. But there are some concerning, deviations from that. some recommendations that have very little support in the literature fairly frequently showing up in the literature, while others that have more support not showing up in documents as often. And now in this chart, we're not saying anything about the citations themselves. We're not assessing the quality, not proving anything. It's just asking questions of the data, what kind of evidence could exist. But we are doing a more in-depth analysis of that that's going into publication soon. Now, when we look at the official reports of mass shootings, which are a sample of incidents in the United States, we tag and count dimensions of the built environment to understand what role the environment played in that. We see much more observations about security technology, which is the reverse of what we see in the recommendations. And we think the people writing these reports are obviously looking and focused on building a narrative of what happened, how the technologies may have failed or helped. But we also see not insignificant focus on circulation, corridors, stairs, basically the evacuation zones, the access to first responders, people moving through space. An example of that is the Uvalde report that talks about the fact that there are entries from both ends of that corridor and there was no cover in the corridor. That created some hesitation, separate groups of responders, and that confusion compounded by failures of communication, of course. It does suggest that we need to try to find systematic ways to better understand or isolate the role of the built environment in that decision making. So an important question is how much can be generalized from one event or a number of extreme events in other contexts and future events. So in the interviews with designers, which you see on the sample on the right, we identified every unique recommendation and coded them in similar categories as what we found in the literature, and found that most architects and the communities they work with are really making decisions with an awareness of these extreme events, but they are prioritizing the more frequent security concerns encountered day to day. So the bullying, the abuse, the domestic situations that may spill into the environment of the school. We are also understanding their constraints and the balancing act with security and the mission and the climate of the school. To understand this, we made sure we talked to a good sample of design teams around the country that specialize in schools, specifically K through 12, elementary to high school, not including higher education campuses. The interviews, is worth noting, are only based in the United States, and it includes the Sandy Hook, the designers of the new Sandy Hook that Mark worked with. The interviews covered all regions of the country, so East Coast, West Coast, South, Midwest. And we stopped when we reached saturation, when we were not getting new information from every additional interview. And we did find some differences across regions, but found many more similarities. Then the analysis, we put them into in vivo, we code them into categories, we search for alignments with the literature. We also look at emerging codes or new practices, what new or emerging problems are designers solving for, what hypotheses they have about what the environment can do, and how they're innovating in that space. A big takeaway from the architects' interviews, they're thinking much more holistically about how how security is adding to the climate and the educational mission, about sustainability, all as part of one thing. Thinking about integrated approaches that can accomplish multiple missions of the school, and acknowledging the limitations, they've had to innovate beyond what we find in current guidelines to reduce triggers, to empower people to respond and to find safety. And then the translation means we're doing some design research ourselves, testing how these emerging ideas from these interviews can be applied in different scenarios or different contexts. How can interventions recognize and mitigate the trade-offs that we're finding? Finally, the user feedback, we're in the beginning stages of distributing these first draft of the guidance to designers, school districts, government officials, to understand and validate that the guidance can be adapted to their own context, that it's usable by different audiences, that we are aware of any potential limitations or additional trade-offs before we refine it into final publication. Now, as architects, we are focused primarily on the built environment, so not the psychological profile of criminals or the public policy solutions that may actually be more effective than the built environment. We are situating these practices, though, into existing theories that emerge from a more interdisciplinary field that look at the influence of the built environment on crime. Two surfaced as important, CPTED, or Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. The interviewees were much more generally aware of this framework, even though they were not as aware of the official guidelines or documents out there. The guidelines also reference, it's more design focused, has more important, some important and influential concepts, but we're finding also some potential challenges. So, the CPTED looks at, the idea of preventing, sort of thinking that the milieu or the environment attracts or resists crime. that you can kind of manipulate behavior through the environment. The focus on territoriality, like the idea that people are familiar with the environment and can notice who belongs and who doesn't, or who's doing something that's familiar versus someone who doesn't. It's a little bit shifting into an insider-outsider mentality and treats the occupants as sort of passive subjects that only activate when they are doing natural surveillance, when they're seeing something, saying something. But the situational crime prevention, a different theory that we saw less mentioned, but perhaps better aligned with what we're hearing from the goals and emerging strategies in practice. So instead of focusing on the motivation of criminals, the goal is on reducing opportunities. So its focus is more on routines, time constraints, and the decision-making in specific situations. For example, how to slow down a perpetrator, how to facilitate response, how to empower people to make decisions through more information, more options. We see this as more aligned with SENTRY's goal of looking at situational awareness. Occupants are active decision makers instead of only passive occupants that we protect. I think the working theory we have is that this is a little bit like the difference between, in climate resilience, we talk about the difference between resisting and resilience. It's giving people agency through information and all that. So we see this as a research opportunity for us to explore how to generalize knowledge by experimenting with design interventions, working with collaborators at SENTRY from University of Southern California, Northeastern, Rutgers, who do agent-based simulations, and to try to glean how these strategies, how these design interventions can give agency to building occupants, how it may affect outcomes during incidents. An important opportunity for simulations is that we can study design strategies or interventions in different environments, supposed to be focused in the specifics of one school or one incident. Design as control experiments, we can change a limited number of variables and explore what happens in a simulation. So one understudied aspect of design for security is the role of typologies, or simply the spatial organization, the formal configuration of school buildings. Even when they're not explicitly mentioned in the recommendations and the incidents, they are subtext. And in some cases, they're explicitly mentioned in interviews. So we decided to bring it to the foreground in our research, to study the impacts of their variations in attributes like circulation, evacuation, number of exits, shelter, et cetera. So we analyzed a sample of school buildings on the left, looked at things like what are the common space types, what are the formal configurations. We organized them according to some basic types, some basic circulation organizations. And then we abstracted them into 4 types: the bar, courtyard, radial, plan, and the cluster. And we looked at the spatial components and the interior organization, the horizontal circulation, the vertical circulation, to begin to explore the variables that we can play with and use those to inform agent-based simulations with our partners in SENTRY, to do design exercises with stakeholders, and to use them as the foundation of the visual standards. Now, as we begin to translate these design experiments into visual guidance, we use these typologies to reveal the role of neighborhood context. For example, how some concepts apply in typologies that work well in suburban environments, like this kind of more sprawling cluster type, versus a different example of the courtyard that may work better for urban blocks. And so the same concepts or strategies need a different tactic when you have more perimeter versus less perimeter. And so we play those scenarios out in the guidelines. This is just a sample. It's good to know that this is not published yet, so these say draft because we're in beginning the round of user feedback, and we expect these will be further refined. But I'll give you a handful of examples of what you may expect to see when these are published. Example of a strategy that emerged from designers actually talking with the Newtown designers, Sandy Hook, the idea of the cluster school, that in a large school, when you have a really big community, you should try to break the scale of the building into smaller learning communities where everyone knows each other. They can notice trouble, they can intervene, they can help each other. The strategy sort of connects with what Mark was saying about making connections between staff and students, having that the ability to know what is happening. So the strategy is really about right-sizing the communities and creating open, flexible learning spaces that are shared by all the classrooms in that community, and that allows a sense of community, but also allows observation. And this highlights the importance of a positive school climate, personal connections, addressing the risks of bullying, isolation. But the trade-off is, of course, that shared spaces are not bounded, they're not lockable. So a mitigation tactic is to have thresholds between the main corridor in a main branch of the building from the branch of the cluster so that this door, for example, can be automatically locked. In a suburban school, that may be the cluster type. Here you see one of the wings of the school zooming in. where you can have that door between the corridor, but we're also studying ways that this can be achieved in the other types where it may be less obvious, like the courtyard type or the bar building. Will this really make a difference in the outcomes of an event? We're hoping that the simulations that are starting now this summer can begin to tell us some information about that. Similarly, another strategy is the idea of creating spaces for shelter during a lockdown, during an event. The guideline mentioned the idea of creating nooks in the corridor where the door can be out of view of an attacker further down in the corridor, not only providing cover, but also creating more of a blind zone, this kind of blue area in the room where occupants can hide when the classroom is locked and give the impression of an empty classroom. Now, designers in interviews suggested the idea of demarcating on the floor with a difference in floor color or material what the blind zone actually is to assist occupants in knowing where to move to and where to remain. Of course, this can have a trade-off that any space for hiding can also be a place where other common security situations like bullying or abuse can occur. But we explored the ways in which this can be mitigated, ensuring that door locks are operated manually from the inside to avoid getting trapped in the room with an abuser or a second door out of the room. Again, the simulations we hope will shed light on the effectiveness of this strategy in agent-based models and potentially reveal, for example, whether these demarcations are more impactful in some typologies than others. Lastly, the observation eliminating opportunities for problematic behavior, may play out in some spaces like restrooms where designers told us they hear it's more common space where they see daily security concerns like bullying or abuse. A tactic for that is a more selective privacy. So increasing the privacy in the restroom stalls can turn them into shelters, but then externalizing the sink areas into shared spaces like corridors to reduce the opportunities for problematic interactions in hidden spaces. This also has the potential of creating more inclusive models for multi-stall restrooms, which is another topic of school climate that's very relevant. But we go beyond the concept to illustrate multiple variations of the same idea. For example, the space type of a restroom with 2 entry and exit points eliminates the potential for trapping people in that space of the stalls, empowering people to protect themselves and others. And there are many other variations that you will see in the publications. This is just an example. So to end, these guidance, which we expect to be published by the end of the year, will be organized around different space types. So, different scales from the site to the building to the individual rooms, different like gathering spaces versus classrooms versus restrooms, et cetera. It will serve primary end users of school districts and their design and construction teams. We're working with CISA, which has the School Safety Task Force of the federal government, to explore how this could be disseminated. We also anticipate this will have secondary users in some of the organizations that have written some of the guidelines we studied by strengthening or expanding their efforts in providing ideas about evidence. And of course, academia and practitioner groups like the American Institute of Architects and others can disseminate those. This will be kind of a synthesis of evidence-based recommendations that will be highly visual. They will be adaptable. They will be a clear representation of a very nuanced and complex set of decisions and trade-offs and their mitigation. And eventually, these guidelines will also incorporate how to implement SENTRY technology, which is still in development in terms of sensors or other decision support components of the system, into different environments. I'll say in terms of next steps, we are focusing schools in the last few years, but we are beginning to replicate this methodology in other venue types, specifically transportation venues, to go through the same type of analysis. I'll leave it there. Hopefully we have a little bit of time to have a little bit of discussion. Thank you.